Marina, former Duchess Lante della Rovere, an astrological portrait by Ciro Discepolo, drawn in May 1988, in Italy 640, in Germany 231, Uni 100 in France, 91 in Turkey, but in Spain there are already 1,003. These are the lines by Leporello, written by Da Ponte in the libretto of Mozart's Don Giovanni, and they refer to the number of conquests of the celebrated libertine. They are also the first free association of ideas that the study of the character Marina, former Duchess Lante della Rovere, has brought to me. But can we interpret the myth of Don Giovanni as a feminine one, knowing, first of all, that puttaniere, whoremonger, when referring to a woman sounds much worse? Or should we instead assume that priapism, a mere expression of priapism, is a prerogative exclusively of men? Here we could open a debate worthy of Linea Rovente and its sarcastic and skilled hosts, and accusations of sexism and anti-feminism may rain down from all sides, but it's not us who argue the illegitimacy of the aforementioned role, but rather someone unsuspecting, like Erika Jong, in a brilliant article in the Corriere della Sera, coinciding with the premiere of Mozart's opera at La Scala, curated and conducted by Strehler and Riccardo Muti. She argued that the role of man-eater was impractical for a real woman, if only for reasons of energy balance and the complexity of every woman's understanding of a relationship, a complexity that precludes any multiple sentimental projects. Marina's tormented, extravagant, poetic, and at times incredible story, however, says the opposite. The former Mrs. della Rovere, whose right to this surname was denied by the Rome court on August 4, 1985, following the requests of her husband, who felt damaged by Mrs. Punturieri's behavior, loved deeply and betrayed just as much, in an obsessive crescendo that seemed poorly inspired by the fear of turning 40, which she then brilliantly passed on October 21, 1981. Marina was born at 2 a.m., wartime, and is therefore a Libra, with Leo ascendant and the moon in Scorpio. The turbulent events of her first 40 years have given rise to a book and a film of the same name. We will not dwell on the latter, which remains, however, a free interpretation of the facts as seen by the director and screenwriter, but will instead pay close attention to the autobiographical account, which should be, at least in the author's stated intentions, a sort of public and complete confession of her private life. Personally, I'm not convinced, and I believe that on more than one point she was extremely reticent. For example, it's hard to explain how all that transgressive and libertine libido exploded so violently after, and not during, her marriage to the Duke. Marina sometimes describes herself mercilessly, offering an image of herself as cynical and sex-hungry, but she is extremely modest in her memories leading up to the separation, trying to imply that it occurred because of a character incompatibility with her husband, and not the consequence of his intense jealousy, who one day, in a crisis worse than the others, allegedly shouted at her, "Our marriage is worthless. Look what I'm doing with our wedding ring. I'm going to eat it." And he actually swallowed it. But reticence or not, the confessional book, or if you prefer the scandalous book, still offers an enormous contribution to anthropology, and no one can say they're uninterested in so much psychological and astrological material. Certain aspects of her life underlie very important concepts worth examining. Anyone reading Marina's memoirs gets the impression, at least for a moment, that she is, so to speak, mad, more than a legitimate suspicion This creeps into the reader, in fact, from the moment the book begins to tell of suitcases thrown from windows, furniture smashed to pieces, and lovers beaten to a pulp. Violence is a constant theme throughout the story. For some particularly dramatic episodes in her past, she herself uses the adjective hysterical and mentions the injections of strong sedatives that were needed to prevent her from jumping into the void. At the Hotel Taran in Paris, in the throes of a jealous fit, she threw one of her companion's heavy suitcases out of the window, then destroyed the chandelier, the dresser, and the other furniture in the room. She then smashed the mirror and meticulously slashed the mattresses with nail clippers. Then, while her hands and feet were spraying blood everywhere from the shards of glass, she began throwing everything, and we are still referring to the testimonies in her book, into the stairwell. And only the intervention of 6 people managed to stop her. But the overall damage caused by all her anger is almost incalculable, and in many places she has left rooms trashed, or thrown bottles at the head, kicked in the legs, and thrown cakes at the face like Maurizio Costanzo live on Grande Italia in front of 20 million viewers. I repeat, anyone might think she's crazy, but she's definitely not. There are, in fact, no signs of psychosis in her horoscope, which actually offers ample reassurance in this regard, proposing a Sun-Moon conjunction that, even if it fails to calm her, guarantees her basic mental balance. But then, how can the violence she inflicted and endured, but above all inflicted, be explained? Simply by the combination of Mars in Aries semi-square to Saturn and Uranus and the Sun in Libra. Let's start with the latter and observe a fundamental thing. No one can be more hostile than an angry Libra. The sign of autumn sunsets in Tuscany, as Bastide defines it, is, when appropriate, the most warlike of the zodiac, perfectly aligned with the values of the Aries-Libra axis, of which it expresses a part. One of the first things to learn in astrology is the value with which the symbol expresses itself. It can constellate itself, or its exact opposite. Libra, therefore, can be found both in the horoscope of the non-violent Gandhi and in the radix chart of warmongers like Hitler and Mussolini, important 7th house. Pay attention, and you will often see Libras clashing over questions of principle, proceeding like speeding locomotives or charging buffalo. The motivation is always a desire for justice, but it is obviously a subjective justice in which our Libras play all roles, from prosecutor to judge, and then by sentencing, they also want to carry out the sentence. Naturally, the Sun in Libra alone is not enough for all this, and so Mars in Aries constitutes a fulcrum of exceptional strength in our Libra, unfortunately often misdirected, given the semi-square to Saturn and Uranus. This aspect, having an orb of approximately 1 degree, is exactly equivalent to a square or an opposition, and reveals the existence of a certain degree of cynicism in the individual, coupled with extreme radicalism. On another level, however, but equally noteworthy, is the quality of his libido, which is certainly not primarily sexual, even though sex plays and has played a huge role in his life. It would be a mistake to sexually motivate his behavior. His energies are, in fact, essentially directed at forging as many social relationships as possible. If we really want to give this behavior a precise name, we must speak of bovarism, simply bovarism, exactly like the one so beautifully described by Flaubert and his Emma Bovary. It can't be explained in a few words, but it rests heavily on 2 realities, the overwhelming desire to connect with others and the idealization of love, which, to be truly true, is sought in romantic and celebratory situations. The presence of the Sun, Moon, and Mercury in the third house in Marina's horoscope emphasizes the role of the centrifugal impulse and tells us that the subject, as a good Libra, values parties almost as much as her own life. Even in the worst moments, in fact, she tells us she never stopped inviting people to her home and organizing receptions and parties. Of the most terrible moments in her life, Marina points to one in particular, even if she doesn't date it. But the book is very lacking in this respect, regarding all the important events of her life. However, it can be traced indirectly because a little further on she refers to the tragic death of Pier Paolo Pasolini, thus revealing that her dark period occurred shortly before, in September 1975. During that period she was abandoned by her great love, the journalist and senator Lino Giannuzzi. The name, like others in the book, could be invented since he doesn't appear in the register of journalists, as well as by another lover, the painter Franco Angeli. Furthermore, she found herself in dire financial straits. The transits of that period indicate Jupiter opposite the Sun, Saturn square it, and Uranus conjunct it. Any comment seems superfluous. Her financial circumstances, according to her own statements, had always been precarious. From her marriage to the noble but impoverished Duke, to her third marriage to Carlo Ripa di Miana, also a noble but penniless in between, there was an invalid marriage in San Marino to the industrialist Giorgio Borsa, and then there's a long list of billionaire lovers who supported her for long periods of her life, from the one she calls Prince Riccio to many other, not always clearly identified, sponsors with whom she developed relationships that sometimes bordered on prostitution, as she herself writes, for example, when speaking of the extremely wealthy Brazilian who allowed her to extend her Christmas vacation in Rio. The celestial sponsor of her horoscope is, of course, Jupiter in the 11th house, sextile the ascendant and trine the sun. This is an exceptionally fortunate position that will perhaps save her from the threats of the unfavorable Saturn-Uranus conjunction in the 10th house, which should be a concern for all those who achieve quickly and without much effort positions of great prestige. But the same position may have already been reflected in the repeated setbacks she has suffered to date, including being evicted several times and ending up in prison for contempt of a public official. Mars in the 9th house was similarly experienced. He traveled more than the Pope. And Neptune in the 2nd, as mentioned above, also brought much anguish but also many murky matters to his finances. Sensual and captivating Venus in the 4th house and in Sagittarius was the great love of the second half of his life. His third husband, Carlo Ripa di Meana, whom he courted extensively before finally marrying. Finally, the dominant Mercury should not be overlooked. It is the most angular star in the sky and is lord of the 1st house, and, by analogy, of the 3rd house, occupied by the Sun and the Moon, to which it is conjunct. It perfectly describes his more than Pyrrhine-like behavior. As a girl, he stole candlesticks from church and then resold them in his shop. We end here, not without wondering who helped her write the book, but also noting that beyond the clamor of a scandalous life, there are also values, for example, expressed in fashion, that should not be underestimated, as beauty and sex alone cannot bring glory, so much so that some beautiful women have ended up in pornography without even becoming members of the Italian Parliament.